Welcome back, accomplices.
I'm sure many of you doubted us given our history, but we love nothing more than to prove people wrong. And while we don't have any updates regarding cases we've covered in previous episodes, we do have our weekly crime report.
Coming to us from Sanibel, Florida, a strung-out, half-naked Florida man swiped a construction worker's vehicle and tried to run him over with it. Then attempted to hide from cops in a porta potty before emerging pantless and wielding 2 wooden stakes, officials said. Of course it was Florida. Joshua Molnix, 43, was arrested after his wild path of destruction along Florida's Cape Coral on October 27th. Molnix, who officials said appeared to be on drugs, wandered off a beach and over to a private property while only wearing a pair of sweatpants. There, he started to berate a construction worker and unsuccessfully tried to break into a shed, according to an arrest affidavit. He then allegedly pivoted to the construction worker's white Nissan SUV, which was unlocked and had the keys inside. Molnix plopped into the driver's seat and aggressively accelerated toward the worker, who dove out of the way in the nick of time, according to the affidavit. From there, the suspect allegedly plowed the SUV through the property's gate and wound up at another site where the Lee County Sheriff's Office responded to reports of a suspicious male hiding in a porta potty. Molnix eventually emerged from the portable toilet on his own accord, but had discarded his sweatpants. A deputy said that they saw him fleeing on foot while wielding 2 wooden stakes, according to the affidavit. He tried to break into another vehicle, but the deputy subdued him with a taser. Officers estimated that Molnix's rampage caused $4,000 in property damage. He was booked in the Lee County Jail after a brief trip to the hospital. He was charged with grand theft auto of a motor vehicle, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and criminal mischief. His arraignment is scheduled for December 8th. And that was a story we got from the New York Post.
Why is it always Florida?
I don't know.
These Florida guys are crazy. All right, well, we're going to get into it. In today's episode, we're going to cover a pretty cringe case. Some triggers may include, but are not limited to, kidnapping, child rape and molestation, cannibalism, genital mutilation, both male and female, and sadism. As always, listener discretion is advised. Albert Hamilton Fish was an American sadomasochist serial killer and cannibal. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wysteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire, amidst other names. He boasted that he, quote, had children in every state, putting the number around 100, although it was not clear whether he was talking about molestation or cannibalism, less still as to whether it was true or not. Yikes. He was, however, a suspect in at least 5 killings in his lifetime. Fish confessed to 3 murders that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19th, 1870, to Randall Fish and Aline Frances Howell. Fish's father was American of English ancestry, and his mother was Scots-Irish American. His father was 43 years older than his mother and aged 75 at the time of his birth. Fish.
What?
That's normal in the 1800s.
I guess. So was trading her for livestock.
That's probably what happened. So Fish was his family's youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wished to be known as Albert after a dead sibling and also to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs that he was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. Fish's family did have a history of mental illness. His uncle had religious mania. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital. A paternal half-brother suffered from schizophrenia, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had auditory and visual hallucinations. On October 6th of 1875, Fish's father, a fertilizer manufacturer and former riverboat captain, suffered a fatal heart attack at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. His mother then put him in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., where he was frequently whipped and beaten, and eventually discovered that he enjoyed physical pain. The beatings would often give him erections, which of course caused the other orphans to make fun of him. But by 1880, Fish's mother secured a government job and was able to remove him from the orphanage. In 1882, age 12, Fish began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces. Fish began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress and spent a great portion of his weekends on these types of visits. By 1980, Fish had arrived in New York City and had said he had become a male prostitute. He also said he began raping young boys, a crime he kept committing even after his mother arranged a marriage for him. 1982. Fish was married to a woman 9 years his junior. They had 6 children: Albert, Anna, Eugene, John, and Henry. He was arrested for embezzlement and was sentenced to incarceration in Sing Sing in 1903. There, he regularly had sex with men. Throughout 1989, he worked as a house painter and he continued molesting children, mostly boys under the age of 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum where Fish was fascinated by bisection of the penis and subsequently became obsessed with sexual mutilation. Soon after, he developed a morbid interest in castration. Several years later, around 1910, Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware, when he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Bedin. He took Bedin to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It's unclear whether the sadomasochism was consensual on Bedin's part, but Fish's later confession implied that Bedin was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Fish took Bedin to, quote, an old farmhouse where he tortured him for over 2 weeks and then eventually tied Bedin up and cut off half of his penis.
Lover things.
And why only half? He said, quote, I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me. Fish later recalled he originally intended to kill Bedin, cut up his body, and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention. Instead, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, kissed Bedin goodbye, and left. So, chivalry was not dead, folks.
Stitched him up and everything. Here's $10.
In the 1800s, $10 is a lot of money.
That is true. Paid him for his service.
Exactly. And his penis.
Only half of it.
Only half. Let's see. Fish said, quote, I took the first train I could back home, never heard what became of him or tried to find out. Fish then began intensifying his visits to brothels where he could be whipped and beaten more often. In January 1917, Fish's wife left him for John Straub. I'm going to assume his last name. He was a handyman who boarded with the Fish family. Fish was subsequently forced to raise his children as a single parent. After his arrest, Fish had told a newspaper that when his wife left him, she took nearly every possession the family owned. Fish began to have auditory hallucinations. He once wrapped himself in a carpet, saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. It was about this time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm by embedding needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, x-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region.
Yikes.
Also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire, which the closest I've ever come to that is eating flaming hot Cheetos. I can
Same sensation.
Imagine the fiery poops. While Fish was never thought to physically attack or abuse his children, he did encourage them and their friends to use the previously mentioned paddle on him. So I would imagine that his friends probably didn't engage in very many sleepovers at the Fish home.
I would hope not.
It's a little weird. Around 1919, Fish stabbed a intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown. He often chose people who were either mentally disabled or African American as his victims. He later explained that he assumed, quote, these people would not be missed when killed.
Wow.
Yeah. Fish would later claim to have occasionally paid boys to procure other children for him. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with his, quote, implements of hell, which included a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. On July 11th, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone on her parents' farm on Staten Island in New York. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away. Fish did leave, but he did return later on to the Keel's barn where he tried to sleep but was discovered by Beatrice's father and forced to leave. In 1924, the 54-year-old Fish, suffering from psychosis, felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. Shortly before he abducted Grace Budd, Fish attempted to test his, quote, implements of hell on a 10-year-old child he had been molesting named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friend were playing box ball on a sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said they had not, he invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. And while the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged his mattress, and underneath was a knife, small handsaw, and of course the meat cleaver. They did become frightened, of course, and ran out of his apartment. And on May 25th, 1928, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, young man 18 wishes position in country, Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. On May 28th, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring Edward. He later confessed that he planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. Fish introduced himself to the family as Frank Howard, who was a farmer from Farmingdale, New York. He promised to hire Bud and his friend and said he would send for them in a few days. Fish did fail to show up, but he sent a telegram to the Bud family apologizing and set a later date. And when he did return, he met Edward's younger sister, 10-year-old Grace Budd. He, at that time, had shifted his intentions towards Grace and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. This part is really cringe for me because he was able to persuade Grace's parents, Delia and Albert, to let Grace accompany him to the party that evening. But of course, he ended up taking her to an abandoned house that he had previously picked out to use for the murder of his next victim. Now, I personally don't have children, and I get that this is like now but who the fuck lets their child just go with a stranger? Wysteria Cottage at 395 Mountain Road, located in the East Irvington neighborhood of Irvington, New York. There, Fish manually strangled her to death, then decapitated and dismembered her body and ate most of the remains over the next several days. The police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Edward Pope on September 5th, 1930, as a suspect in Grace's disappearance, accused by Pope's estranged wife. Pope did spend 108 days in jail between his arrest and trial on December 22nd, 1930, but eventually was found not guilty. So there was a letter that was sent to Grace Budd's mother in November 1934. An anonymous letter sent to Grace's parents ultimately led the police to Fish. Budd's mother was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it to her. This letter is very cringe. It does go into a lot of the details of what he did. If you are faint of heart or have a weak stomach, you might want to turn this off now. So the unaltered letter reads, "My dear Miss Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11, took them to his home, stripped them naked, tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them, made their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and, of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at East 100 Street near Right Side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, called on you at 406 West 15th Street, brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was, roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have, had I wished. She died a virgin. That's where the letter ends.
A gentleman.
So police investigated the letter, and although the story concerning Captain Davis and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified, the part of the letter concerning the murder of Grace was found to be accurate in its description of the kidnapping and subsequent events, though it was impossible to confirm whether Fish had actually eaten parts of Grace's body. But I mean, he told you that he was going to, so. The letter was delivered in an envelope that had a small hexagonal emblem and the letters NYPCBA, representing New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. A janitor at the company told the police he had taken some of the stationery home but left it at his rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street when he moved out. The landlady of the rooming house said that Fish checked out of that room a few days earlier. She said that Fish's son sent him money and he asked her to hold his next check for him. Detective William King, the chief investigator for the case, waited outside of the room until Fish returned. He agreed to go to headquarters for questioning, then brandished a razor blade. King disarmed Fish and took him to police headquarters. Fish made no attempt to deny the murder of Grace Budd, saying he meant to go to the house to kill her brother Edward. He then said that it, quote, never even entered his head to rape the girl, but he later claimed to his attorney that while kneeling on Grace's chest and strangling her, he did have 2 involuntary ejaculations. And this information was used at trial to make the claim that kidnapping was sexually motivated, thus avoiding any mention of cannibalism.
The fuck?
Ooh, okay. So there were additional crimes that were discovered after Fish's arrest. So during the night of July 14th, 1924, 9-year-old Francis McDonnell was reported missing after he failed to return home after playing catch with friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island. A search was organized and his body was found hanging from a tree in a wooded area near his home. He had been sexually assaulted and then strangled with his suspenders. According to an autopsy, McDonnell had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had almost entirely been stripped of its flesh. Fish refused to claim responsibility for this, although he later stated that he intended to castrate the boy but fled when he heard someone approaching the area. McDonnell's friends told the police that he was taken by an elderly man with a gray mustache. A neighbor also told the police he observed the boy with a similar looking man walking along a grassy path into the nearby woods. Francis's mother, Anna McDonnell, said she saw the same man earlier that day, telling reporters, quote, "He came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself and making queer motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded to gray." This description resulted in the mysterious stranger becoming known as the Gray Man. The McDonnell murder remained unsolved until the murder of Bud, when several eyewitnesses, among them the Staten Island farmer Hans Keel, positively identified Fish as the odd stranger seen around Port Richmond on the day of McDonnell's disappearance. Richmond County District Attorney Thomas Walsh announced his intention to seek an indictment against Fish for the boy's murder. At first, Fish denied the charges. It was only in March of 1935, after the conclusion of his trial for the Budd murder and his confession of the killing of Billy Gaffney, that he confirmed to investigators that he had also raped and murdered McDonnell. When the McDonnell confession was made public, the New York Daily Mirror wrote that the disclosure solidified Fish's reputation as, quote, "the most vicious child slayer in criminal history." That is a mouthful. All right. On February 11th, 1927, 3-year-old Billy Beaton and his 12-year-old brother were playing in the apartment hallway in Brooklyn with 4-year-old William Billy Gaffney. When the 12-year-old left for his apartment, both younger boys disappeared. Beaton was found later on the roof of the apartments. When asked what happened to Gaffney, Beaton said, quote, "The boogeyman took him." Gaffney's body was never recovered. Initially, serial killer Peter Kudzanowski was a suspect in Gaffney's murder. When Joseph Meehan, motorman on a Brooklyn trolley, saw a picture of Fish in a newspaper and identified him as the old man whom he saw February 11th, 1927. The man had been trying to quiet a little boy sitting with him on the trolley. The boy was not wearing a jacket, was crying for his mother, was dragged by the man on and off the trolley. Beaton's description of the, quote, boogeyman matched Fish. Police matched the description of the child to Gaffney. Detectives of the Manhattan Missing Persons Bureau were able to establish that Fish was employed as a house painter by the Brooklyn Real Estate Company during February 1927, and that on the day of Gaffney's disappearance, he was working at a location a few miles from where the boy was abducted. Gaffney's mother, Elizabeth Gaffney, visited Fish in Sing Sing, accompanied by Detective King. She wanted to ask him about her son's death, but Fish refused to speak to her. However, Fish did claim the following in the letter to his attorney. He said, "I brought him to the Riker Avenue dumps. There is a house that stands alone, not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked, and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirty rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat of 9 tails, homemade short handle, cut one of my belts in half, slit these half in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood. I picked up 4 old potato sacks and gathered a pile of stones. Then I cut him up. I had a grip with me. I put his nose, ears, and a few slices of his belly in the grip. Then I cut him through the middle of his body, just below his belly button, then through his legs, about 2 inches below his behind. I put this in my grip with a lot of paper. I cut off the head, feet, arms, hands, and the legs below the knee. I put in sacks weighed with stones, tied the ends, and threw them into the pools of slimy water you will see all along the road going to North Beach. Water is 3 to 4 feet deep. They sank at once. I came home with my meat. I had the front of his body I liked best, his monkey and peewees, and a nice little fat behind to roast in the oven and eat. I made a stew out of his ears, nose, pieces of his face and belly. I put onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. It was good. Then I split the cheeks of his behind open, cut off his monkey and peewees, and washed them first. I put strips of bacon on each cheek of his behind and put it in the oven. Then I picked 4 onions, and when meat had roasted about a fourth of an hour, I poured about a pint of water over it for gravy and put in the onions. At frequent intervals, I basted his behind with a wooden spoon so the meat would be nice and juicy. In about 2 hours, it was nice and brown, cooked through. I never ate any roast turkey that tasted half as good as his sweet fat little behind did. I ate every bit of the meat in about 4 days. His little monkey was as sweet as a nut, but his peewees I could not chew. Threw them in the toilet. Fish's trial for the murder of Grace Budd began on March 11th, 1935 in White Plains, New York. Frederick P. Close presided as judge, and Westchester County Chief Assistant District Attorney Albert F. Gallagher was prosecuting attorney. Fish's defense counsel was James Dempsey, a former prosecutor for the one-time mayor of Peekskill, New York. The trial lasted for 10 days. Fish pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes, which included sadism and masochism, whipping and flogging, exhibitionism, voyeurism, urine fetish, pedophilia, necrophilia, and male and female genital mutilation. Dempsey, in his summation, noted that Fish was a quote-unquote psychiatric phenomenon and that nowhere in legal or medical records was there another individual who possessed so many sexual abnormalities. The defense's chief expert witness was Frederick Weatherham, a psychiatrist with an emphasis on child development who conducted psychiatric examinations of the New York criminal courts. During 2 days of testimony, Weatherham explained Fish's obsession with religion and specifically his preoccupation with the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, Genesis 20:24. Weatherham said that Fish believed that similarly, quote, sacrificing a boy would be penance for his own sins, and that even if the act itself was wrong, angels would prevent it if God did not approve. Fish attempted the sacrifice once before, but was thwarted when a car drove past. Edward Budd was the next intended victim, but he turned out to be larger than expected, so he settled on Grace. Although he knew Grace was female, it is believed that Fish perceived her as a boy. Weatherham then detailed Fish's cannibalism, which in his mind he associated with communion. The last question Dempsey asked Weatherham was 15,000 words long, detailed Fish's life, and ended with asking how the doctor considered his mental condition based on his life. Weatherham simply answered, quote, "He is insane." You're not going to get any argument from me. So Gallagher then, of course, cross-examines Weatherham on whether Fish knew the difference between right and wrong. He responded that he did know, but that it was a perverted knowledge based on his opinions of sin, atonement, and religion, and thus was a, quote, insane knowledge. The defense called two more psychiatrists to support Weatherham's findings. The first four rebuttal witnesses was Minas Gregory, a former manager of the Bellevue Hospital where Fish was treated during 1930. He testified that Fish was abnormal but sane. Under cross-examination, Dempsey asked if it's called corporophilia and urophilia, which is a fetish with urine and feces, and then also pedophilia indicated a sane or insane person. Gregory replied that such a person was not, quote, mentally sick, and that these were common perversions that were, quote, socially perfectly all right. I don't know. Even though that was the case, they stated that Fish was, quote, no different from millions of other people, some very prominent and successful who had the very same perversions. The next witness was the resident physician at the Tombs, Perry Lichtenstein. Dempsey objected to the doctor with no training in psychiatry testifying in the issue of sanity, but Justice Close overruled on the bias that the jury could decide what weight to give a prison doctor. When asked whether Fish's causing himself pain indicated a mental condition, Lichtenstein replied, quote, that is not masochism, as he was only, quote, punishing himself to get sexual gratification. The next witness, Charles Lambert, testified that coprophilia was a common practice and that religious cannibalism may be psychopathic, but, quote, was a matter of taste. That's fucking cringe. And not evidence of a psychosis. The last witness, James Vavassor, repeated Lambert's Another defense witness was Mary Nichols, Fish's 17-year-old stepdaughter. She described how Fish taught her and her brothers and sisters several games involving overtones and masochism and child molestation. None of the jurors, of course, doubted that Fish was insane, but ultimately, as one later explained, they felt he should be executed anyways. They found him to be sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced the defendant to death by electrocution. Fish arrived at the prison in March of 1935 and was executed on January 16, 1936 in the electric chair at Sing Sing. He entered the chamber at 11:06 p.m. and was pronounced dead 3 minutes later. He was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery. It is said to have helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. His last words were reportedly, quote, I don't even know why I'm here. And according to one witness that was present, it took 2 jolts before Fish died, creating the rumor that the apparatus was short-circuited by the needles that Fish had inserted into his body. The rumors were later regarded as untrue, as Fish reportedly died in the same fashion and time frame as others in the electric chair. At a meeting with reporters after the execution, Fish's lawyer, James Dempsey, revealed that he was in possession of his client's, quote, final statement. This amounted to several pages of handwritten notes that Fish apparently penned in the hours just prior to his death. When pressed by the assembled journalists to reveal the document's contents, Dempsey refused, stating, quote, I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read. And that is the case and crimes of Albert Fish. It's a lot. I know.
Yeah.
Well, if you guys are still with us, congratulations. You made it this far. You're just as fucked up as we are.
Probably need a drink after that.
Yeah.
Join us again next week for your weekly dose of thick thighs and murder vibes. I don't want to give too much away, but we are working on something special.
As always, we love hearing from you. So hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, or by emailing us at thickthighsmurdervibes@gmail.com. But for now, we're going to get out of here. Until next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.